Whispers beneath the floorboards. The first time I saw the Deane House, it felt like walking into a funeral. Its Victorian spires clawed at the gray Calgary sky, the manicured gardens too perfect, too still. I stood at the iron gates, my hand-painted sign proclaiming, "This land remembers," held high, while autumn leaves skittered across the pavement like fleeing spirits. My name is Sarah Eaglefeather, and I've been an Indigenous rights activist for over a decade. But this protest felt different, personal. The Deane House stood on land where my ancestors had held sacred ceremonies for millennia before some Mountie decided it'd make a cute tea room. 7 protesters showed up. 7. I tried not to let my disappointment show as we chanted and waved our signs. From a second-floor window, I spotted Victor Deane IV. Yes, that Deane, great-grandson of the original owner, watching us with detached amusement. He sipped what I imagined was a $90 scotch, completely unmoved by our presence. "You're trespassing on stolen ground," I shouted, my breath frosting in the October air. He raised his glass in a mock toast. That's when I decided to break in. I waited until well past midnight, when the last of the fancy diners had stumbled out to their cars. The moonlight silvered the Deane House roof as I slipped through the service entrance, my heart pounding. My medicine pouch held tobacco, sweetgrass, and a fragment of my great-grandmother's ceremonial drum, sacred objects I hoped would protect me. The floorboards creaked a warning as I made my way to the formal dining room. According to the archival maps I'd studied, this room was built directly over the old Sundance grounds. I knelt in the center, sprinkling tobacco in a circle around me. "Nitanis, kia wichitasonan," I whispered. "Grandmother, we need your help." The air suddenly turned thick with the smell of burning sage, except my sweetgrass was still braided, unlit. A child's laughter echoed from the fireplace, sending chills down my spine. Then came the thudding, rhythmic and primal, from beneath the floor. Footsteps, dozens of them, running in unison. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my throat. But before I could flee, the sounds faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. I left the tobacco circle intact and hurried out, unsure if what I'd experienced was real or just my imagination playing tricks. 3 days later, Victor Deane cornered me at City Hall after a zoning meeting. "My pastry chef quit," he hissed, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Claimed she saw a thing in the walk-in, like a person, but wrong." I almost laughed. "Told you this land's cursed." "Cursed?" He gripped my arm, his fingers trembling. "My sommelier found teeth in a 97 Bordeaux, human teeth." That got my attention. Despite our adversarial relationship, I could see genuine fear in Victor's eyes. We agreed to meet at midnight, capitalist and activist, united by a shared dread of what was happening in the Deane House. Victor's security footage showed blurry figures moving near the wine cellar. My voice recorder, which I'd left hidden in the dining room, captured chanting in Cree, a language none of the staff spoke. "They're getting louder," I noted, rewinding the recording. Victor poured 2 fingers of whiskey, his hand trembling as he handed me a glass. "Last night, the dessert plates. The chocolate ganache spelled out leave in syllabics." I froze. "You can read syllabics?" "Google Translate," he admitted sheepishly. We spent the next few nights investigating, documenting increasingly disturbing occurrences. Silverware bent into unnatural shapes, walls that bled a sap-like substance, the constant, muffled sound of drums that only we seemed to hear. It all came to a head when we found the hidden chamber behind the wine racks. A rusted door with a Blackfoot sun symbol etched into its surface stood before us, Victor's skeleton key fitting perfectly into the lock. The stench that hit us as we entered made my stomach churn, iron and wet earth. Shelves lined the walls, filled with artifacts that made my blood run cold. Beaded moccasins, a cradle board, even a bundle of scalps tagged like museum pieces. "Christ?" Victor whispered, his face pale in the dim light. A cold wind slammed the door shut behind us. The single light bulb overhead burst, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, something crunched beneath my boots. Victor's phone flashlight revealed what I'd stepped on. Bones. Small ones. Children's. The air filled with wailing. We fled the chamber, but the horrors followed. That night, at precisely 3:33 a.m., they came for us. Victor and I stood back to back in the dining room, armed with sage and a fire extinguisher. The floorboards bulged upward, splintering as shadow figures emerged, translucent but bleeding real sap from maple leaf tattoos. "Ikakwi," I shouted. "Mother!" The fragment of my great-grandmother's drum grew hot in my pocket. The shadows paused, their featureless faces turning towards me. "Now!" I thrust the drum fragment at Victor. Understanding flashed in his eyes. He smashed it against the floor with all his strength. The shadows screamed, a sound of anguish and release that shook the very foundations of the house. In a swirl of ethereal mist, they dissipated, leaving behind only the splintered floorboards and the lingering scent of sage. At dawn, we burned the artifacts from the hidden chamber, despite Victor's initial whimpers about their historic value. The flames turned an unnatural blue-green, consuming scalps and cradleboard without producing any smoke. As the fire died down, I heard a child's laughter one last time, fainter now, peaceful. I vomited by the rose bushes, the horror of what we'd discovered finally hitting me full force. Victor stood silently, staring at his blistered hands. "They're gone?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain, a leaf brushed cheek, too gently to be natural. I shivered. "Resting," I corrected, "but not gone. This land remembers." In the weeks that followed, Victor and I formed an unlikely alliance. He donated the Deane House to the Siksika Nation, and we've transformed it into a community center. I'm even teaching him Cree phrases, much to the amusement of the elders who visit. But the past isn't so easily laid to rest. Sometimes, when the northern lights flare unusually bright, we find fresh tobacco scattered near that hidden chamber. Neither of us mentions it, but we both know. The spirits are still here, watching, waiting. We've made peace with them, for now. But I can't shake the feeling that if we ever forget the true history of this place, if we ever stop honoring the sacred ground beneath our feet, they'll return. And next time they might not be so easily appeased. So we remember, we teach. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the old house, we listen. To the stories, to the warnings, to the voices that have been silenced for far too long. This land remembers, and now, so do we. The stain that breathes. I've always been drawn to the unexplained, but the blood stain in the Deane House attic was different. It called to me. From the moment I read about it in the 1998 Journal of Spectral Phenomena, I knew I had to investigate it myself. It took years of networking, begging, and finally offering my services as a paranormal consultant for free, but I finally got access to that infamous attic. The caretakers thought I was eccentric, sure, but they didn't realize the depths of my obsession. They didn't know about the Father Malone's 1897 exorcism diary I'd stolen from the Calgary Diocese archives, or the thousands I'd spent on specialized equipment. On my first night in the attic, I meticulously mapped the stain's edges, 23.4 centimeters exactly, with a temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 16 degrees colder than the surrounding floorboards. My array of EMF readers chirped like demented crickets as I worked, and I duct-taped a GoPro to one of the ceiling beams for constant surveillance. As I was setting up, Marjorie, the house historian, poked her head through the attic door. Her eyes were full of concern as she warned me, "That stain's like a bad tooth. Keep picking at it, and the whole jaw might come loose." I smiled and nodded, but inside I was buzzing with excitement. I was sure I was on the verge of a breakthrough. I should have listened to her. It was exactly midnight when everything changed. The stain began to weep. Not metaphorically, actual thick, syrupy droplets welled up from its center, defying gravity to creep upward along the floorboards. My infrared camera captured it all. 37 degrees Fahrenheit liquid with the viscosity of motor oil. I scrambled to collect a sample, my gloved hands shaking as the vial grew unnaturally cold. Then came the laughter. A child's giggle, sharp as broken glass, echoed from the corner where a rusted 1930s toy soldier lay. The EMF spiked to 12.3 milligauss, enough to induce cardiac arrest in lab mice. My mind raced through the house's history, and a name bubbled to the surface. "Samuel Gibbons," I whispered. The 14-year-old epileptic boy who'd been bullied mercilessly, who'd hung himself from these very rafters on June 13, 1933. The stain pulsed like a heartbeat in response. Over the next 2 weeks, I barely left the attic. I slept in fitful bursts, always jolting awake at 11:59 p.m. when the stain would activate. I timed the 4.7-second delay between droplet formations, recorded the 28 degrees temperature drop that preceded each bout of audible phenomena. The caretaker stopped bringing me coffee. Only Marjorie seemed to care, leaving newspaper clippings about the house's dark history outside the attic door. "Don't become part of the collection," her latest note warned. I scoffed, high on the thrill of discovery. The real breakthrough came when I overlaid historical dates on my thermal maps. Every major tragedy in the house's history had occurred during Mercury retrograde. With trembling hands, I checked my calendar. Mercury was due to go stationary retrograde in just 3 days. I knew I was onto something big, too big perhaps. In a moment of what I can only describe as temporary insanity, I decided to bring a Ouija board to the attic. Told myself it was just a prop, something to liven up a video for my growing YouTube following. But deep down, I think I knew I was crossing a line. At 11:59 p.m. on October 28th, as I dozed in my sleeping bag, the planchette began to move on its own. My blood ran cold as it spelled out, SAMUEL. I tried to lift my hands, but they were stuck fast. My fingernails splintered against the wood as I struggled. The planchette carved a crescent moon symbol into the board's surface. "Stop," I managed to choke out. HELPUS. The stain erupted like a geyser, drenching my equipment in black fluid. Where it touched my skin, blisters formed in intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like noose knots. The pain was excruciating, but not as terrifying as the realization that I was no longer in control. Mercury turned retrograde at 3:47 a.m. on October 31st. I stood barefoot on the stain. Father Malone's diary opened to page 113, the account of his failed 1927 exorcism. I'd drawn salt circles and placed hawthorn branches in a desperate attempt at protection. The air grew thick, almost solid. Samuel materialized first, his pale neck ringed with rope burns. Then came others. A woman clutching at stab wounds in her chest, a man with half his face blown away by a shotgun. 12 spirits in total, their deaths spanning from 1906 to 1952. As I stared at them, a horrible realization dawned. "They're not ghosts," I whispered, tasting copper in my mouth. "They're templates." The stain bubbled and shifted, forming a new silhouette. My blood ran cold as I recognized my own hunched form, a spectral noose forming around my neck. I screamed the Latin rites through bleeding gums, my voice cracking with terror. Samuel's spirit lunged at me, his icy fingers fusing with mine. Together, driven by a force I couldn't understand, we tore at the floorboards. Beneath the rotting wood, we exposed the source of the bloodstain, a Cree medicine bundle buried in the house's very foundation. Bare teeth, sage, a lock of human hair. The house itself seemed to roar in protest as I grabbed my butane torch. With shaking hands, I set the bundle ablaze. The spirits wailed as the stain ignited, burning with an otherworldly blue-black flame like an oil fire. I don't remember much after that. They found me unconscious, with third-degree burns in the shape of handprints across my chest. The official report cited faulty wiring as the cause of the fire that destroyed the attic. The Deane House now boasts a gleaming new event space where those haunted rooms once stood. My YouTube channel exploded overnight, gaining 500,000 subscribers. I should be thrilled, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. No one else notices the new stain forming on my apartment ceiling, growing larger by the day. This morning, my ex-wife called in tears. "Our daughter has started sleepwalking," she said, whispering in a language that makes their dog's nose bleed. With a sense of dread, I checked the calendar. Mercury goes retrograde in 7 hours. The stain above my bed pulses gently, hungry for new templates, and I fear I may have only succeeded in bringing the horror home with me. The recipe in the blood. I should have known something was off the moment I stepped into the Deane House kitchen. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. But I was desperate for a fresh start, and this sous chef position seemed like my ticket to a better life. "My name is Claire," and I'd come to the Deane House to outrun my past. 3 maxed out credit cards, an ex-husband who thought alimony meant sending dick pics instead of checks, and a little meth problem I'd kicked in rehab. The restaurant offered cash under the table and staff meals that included foie gras scraps. It seemed like salvation. On my first day, while julienning shallots, I sliced clean through my thumbnail. Chef Baptiste laughed it off. Battle scars make the cook. But the way my blood pooled on the maple cutting board felt wrong. Too dark, too thick. Like the stain on the dining room ceiling, everyone pretended was wine. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, focusing instead on the intricate French techniques Chef Baptiste was teaching me. But then the memories started. Memories that weren't my own. It happened during the sage butter emulsion. One moment I was whisking clarified butter into brown sage leaves. The next I was kneeling on cold flagstones, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. A man's boots entered my vision, polished leather stained with something darker. "Eleanor," the man growled, "the captain wants his supper." The memory shattered when Chef Baptiste grabbed my shaking wrist. "Christ, Claire, you're burning it." The sage butter had blackened into tar. After that, the visions came faster and more frequently. While peeling potatoes, I'd see blood under my fingernails. Restocking the walk-in, I'd smell gunpowder instead of aged ribeyes. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe some lingering effects from my past drug use. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The final straw came when I found a tarnished locket in the dry goods pantry, a heart-shaped thing with EW engraved on the back. My hands trembled as I held it, a flood of foreign emotions washing over me. Love, fear, betrayal. I showed the locket to Marjorie, the house historian. Her face turned pale as she examined it. "Eleanor Whitcomb," she whispered. "Captain Deane's second wife. Died in 1912, I finished without thinking. Fire in the music room." Marjorie's eyes narrowed. "How'd you know that?" I couldn't answer. How could I explain that I was experiencing memories of a woman who died over a century ago? Things came to a head during a special event at the restaurant, a 12-course historical horror tasting menu. I was plating venison medallions when the first guest screamed. A woman at table 6 pointed mutely at her butter knife. The monogram DH had bled into a crude noose. Around the room, silverware began to twist, forks into claw shapes, spoons curling like burnt paper. In the chaos, I fled to the pantry. Bad move. The shelves pulsed like lungs. Jarred cherries bubbled into something arterial. And there, in the shifting shadows, stood Eleanor, a column of smoke shaped like a woman, her charred hands clutching her locket. She showed me everything. The captain's fist cracking across Eleanor's jaw for dancing with Thomas, the stable hand. The accidental fire set during her Chopin recital. How she'd run back into the flames to save her recipe book, a book filled with more than just culinary secrets. "Finish it," Eleanor hissed through blackened lips. I found myself at the vintage Agay stove, hands moving independently. Flour, ash, blood from my split knuckles. The dough took shape, a grotesque gingerbread man with the captain's face. "Bake the reckoning," Eleanor whispered. The oven flared to 1,000 degrees far beyond its normal capabilities. As the heat intensified, I felt Eleanor's presence merge with mine. Her memories, her pain, her desire for vengeance, it all became part of me. The next thing I remember is waking up in the parking lot, surrounded by firefighters. The locket was fused to my palm, leaving a heart-shaped scar. 11 diners were hospitalized with second-degree burns shaped like musical notes. The official report blamed faulty gas lines, but I knew the truth. Chef Baptiste left a voicemail. "Don't come back, ever." I didn't need to. Eleanor's vengeance was complete, but our connection remained. In the weeks that followed, I found myself compelled to write down the recipes that flooded my mind. Eleanor's recipes, infused with more than just culinary skill. To my surprise, they became an instant hit online. Captain's Damnation Cake, with its cayenne-infused ganache and edible gold leaf nooses, went viral on TikTok. Now I'm running a pop-up supper club in Banff, serving a historical horror menu that books out within minutes. The scar on my palm throbs when Mercury goes into retrograde, and sometimes I catch glimpses of Eleanor in reflective surfaces. watching me work. Last night, a regular customer brought her young daughter. The girl stared at my locket throughout the meal, her eyes wide with a knowledge beyond her years. "Mommy," she whispered, too loud. "Why does that lady have two shadows?" I pretended not to hear, but I felt Eleanor's satisfaction ripple through me. This morning a package arrived, no return address. Inside was Eleanor's original recipe book, its pages yellowed and stained. On the final page, in spidery script, I found a list. Ingredients for resurrection: 1 living chef, regretful; 12 willing diners, 1 unresolved murder. My next pop-up is tomorrow, we're fully booked. As I prepare the mise en place, I can feel Eleanor's presence growing stronger. The line between her memories and mine blurs more each day. Part of me wants to run, to break this supernatural connection. But a larger part, the part that now speaks with Eleanor's voice, knows that our work isn't finished. The captain's spirit still lingers in this world, unpunished. And Eleanor's recipes hold the key to setting things right. So I'll keep cooking, serving up dishes infused with history and vengeance. And when the time is right, when all the ingredients align, Eleanor and I will complete the final recipe together. After all, revenge is a dish best served with a side of supernatural horror. The Phantom Duet. I never should have taken that job at the Deane House. But after 6 months of sleeping in my Honda Civic between gigs, the restaurant's live-in caretaker offer felt like divine intervention. Free room in the attic apartment, leftover gourmet meals, and $18 an hour to play jazz standards for tourists pretending not to stare at the mysterious bloodstain on the ceiling. How could I refuse? The manager had warned me about the place's atmospheric quirks, but I brushed it off as marketing hype. Old houses creak, right? But on my third night, as I dozed off on my makeshift bed of barstool cushions near the grand piano, I learned just how wrong I was. The first note struck at precisely 2:17 a.m., jolting me awake. Sheet music clung to my cheek as I sat up, disoriented. The room had gone ice cold, my breath visible in the moonlight streaming through the attic window. Then came the sound that would haunt my dreams for months to come. Piano keys depressing in a ripple of minor chords, a melody like weeping. But I was alone in the room, and my hands were nowhere near the instrument. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The ghostly tune shifted to a warped version of Chopin's Nocturne Op. No. 1. Familiar, yet wrong. Notes were missing, extra sharps added, transforming the piece into some kind of drunken requiem. I scrambled for my phone, but as my fingers brushed the screen, the piano lid slammed shut with a bang that echoed through the empty house. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Over the next few weeks, I charted the patterns of these nocturnal concerts, always at 2:17 a.m., always on the Black Keys as if played by phantom fists, and always accompanied by a cold spot that spread from the piano to envelop my ankles in icy tendrils. Desperate for answers, I cornered Marjorie, the restaurant's elderly historian. During lunch prep, she found me hunched over my phone, frantically Googling haunted pianos between chopping vegetables. "Ah," she said, a glimmer of grim fascination in her eyes as she polished wine glasses. "You've met our permanent residents, I see." She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Captain Deane's wife, you know, burned to death in that very room back in 1912. It was their anniversary, and she was giving a recital. The curtains caught fire. Some say it wasn't an accident. Her lover tried to save her, jumped right through the window, broke his neck on the flagstones below." That night, heart pounding, I left a dictaphone on the piano before retreating to my cushion nest. The next morning, the playback made my blood run cold. Behind the eerie melody, I could clearly hear 2 distinct breathing patterns. I began leaving offerings, a shot of bourbon on the piano lid, a fresh rose in a crystal vase. To my surprise, the music turned almost cooperative, playful even. One night, emboldened by this shift, I dared to sit at the keys and improvise over the ghostly bass line. It was a terrible mistake. The temperature plummeted instantly, my fingers sticking painfully to the ivory. The melody twisted, warping into the ominous strains of disarray. Worse, shadows began to coalesce at the edges of my vision. a woman in a charred Edwardian gown, a man with his head bent at an unnatural angle. Their ethereal duet crescendoed into an inhuman scream that shook the windows. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands trembled as I threw clothes and sheet music into a suitcase, determined to leave this cursed place behind. But Marjorie appeared in the doorway, clutching a battered leather journal. "You can't go," she said, her eyes wide. "You're the first they've acknowledged since 1952. Eleanor and Thomas, the lovers. The captain, he found out, shot Thomas on the porch then." She swallowed hard. "Then he let Eleanor burn." A mournful chord reverberated from upstairs, and the attic stairs creaked ominously. "They're trapped," Marjorie whispered, "reliving that night over and over. You have to play them out, help them move on." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something deeper, pity, maybe, or a musician's duty to the music itself, rooted me to the spot. At 2:17 a.m., I found myself seated at the piano once more, Thomas's journal open before me. As my fingers touched the keys, I felt blistered hands materialize over mine. We began to play, the duet Eleanor and Thomas had rehearsed a century ago, never to perform. Debussy's Clair de Lune intertwined with the solemn notes of taps. A lament for loves both realized and lost. Smoke stung my eyes and heat blistered my neck as the ghostly fire raged around us. But we played on, the music swelling to a crescendo that shook the very foundations of the house. As the final chord rang out, a blinding light filled the room, and I knew no more. I woke up in the emergency room with second-degree burns on my hands and a story no one believed. The Deane House manager claimed an electrical fire had destroyed the piano. My hands would heal, doctors assured me, but I'd likely never play professionally again. To my shock, a hastily created GoFundMe for a new keyboard went viral. $34,000 raised in just 2 days. What the generous donors didn't know about were the frostbite scars hidden beneath the bandages. These days, I still perform, though my repertoire has changed. Every gig, without fail, I play Eleanor and Thomas's duet. Sometimes, when the club lights flicker just so, I catch a glimpse of them in the back booth, she picking at her scorched gloves, he adjusting his permanently crooked tie. They always vanish before the encore. I thought it was over, that I'd helped them find peace. But last night, my phone buzzed at 2:17 a.m., a Calgary area code. Through crackling static, a terrified voice, the Deane House's new pianist, whispered, "They're asking for you." I'm on I-90 North as I dictate this, my car filled with the mingled scents of sage and smoke. I realize now that Eleanor and Thomas don't need peace. They need a permanent accompanist, and God help me, I'm answering the call. The disconnected line. I've been a telephone repair technician for 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. Lines chewed through by rats, phones that ring when they shouldn't, even a landline that somehow picked up police radio chatter. But nothing prepared me for the Deane House. It was a slow Tuesday when the call came in. I was lounging in the break room, scrolling through my phone and wondering if I should just clock out early. Then the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Got a weird one for you, Mike. Deane House Restaurant. They've got a phone in the bar that keeps ringing, but it's not connected to anything. No wires, no line, nothing." I almost laughed. It had to be a prank call, right? But work had been slow and I needed the paycheck. So I grabbed my tools and headed out, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. The Deane House loomed before me, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the modern buildings surrounding it. I'd heard stories about this place, whispers of hauntings and tragic deaths. But ghosts don't make phone calls, I told myself as I walked up the creaking steps. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a weight in the air, like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing. The bar was empty, except for the phone, an old rotary model sitting on the counter, its black finish gleaming under the dim light. The manager, a nervous woman in her 50s, met me at the door. "It rang 3 times this morning," she said, her voice low as if she didn't want to be overheard. No one was on the line when we answered. I nodded, trying to keep my skepticism in check. "I'll take a look." I started with the basics. checking for hidden wires or Bluetooth devices that could explain the ringing. But there was nothing. The phone wasn't connected to any network or power source. It was just there. Then it rang. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, sharp and jarring. My heart jumped into my throat as I stared at the phone, its rotary dial vibrating slightly with each ring. "Are you going to answer it?" the manager whispered from behind me. I hesitated before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" Static hissed on the other end, followed by a faint voice, so faint I could barely make it out. It sounded like a woman whispering through layers of distortion. "Help me." The line went dead. I spent hours trying to make sense of it. I tested every frequency and signal detector I had, but nothing explained how an unconnected phone could ring, or how I'd heard that voice. As night fell and the Deane House emptied out, I decided to dig deeper. The manager had left me alone with the keys, clearly eager to be anywhere else. "Lock up when you're done," she said before rushing out. I began exploring the building, hoping to find some clue about what was happening. The house was full of creaks and groans, its wooden floors warping with age. My footsteps echoed as I moved from room to room, each one more unsettling than the last. In an upstairs storage closet, I found something strange, an old switchboard covered in dust and cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but when I brushed off the grime, I saw something chilling. A single cord plugged into line 4. Line 4 wasn't supposed to exist anymore. As soon as I touched the cord, static filled my ears, not from any device, but from everywhere around me. It was as if the air itself was buzzing with interference. Then came the voices. Dozens of them, men and women, speaking over each other in frantic whispers. Their words overlapped too much to understand fully, but one phrase stood out: "Don't let him find you." The lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the room despite the windows being shut tight. My breath came out in white puffs as frost began creeping along the walls. I stumbled back downstairs toward the bar, desperate for some sense of normalcy. But when I reached it, my blood ran cold. The phone was off the hook. It rang again, this time louder than before, almost deafening in its intensity. My hands shook as I picked up the receiver. "Who is this?" I demanded. The voice on the other end was clearer now, a woman's voice filled with fear and urgency. "He's coming," she said. Who's coming?" Before she could answer, a deep male voice cut through her words like thunder. "Get out." The line went dead again, but this time something changed. The air grew heavier, oppressive, as if an unseen force were pressing down on me. Then I saw him. A figure stood at the far end of the bar, a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He didn't move or speak. He just stood there, watching me. I backed away slowly until my heel hit something solid. The rotary phone had somehow moved behind me without making a sound. The man took a step forward. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my tools and bolted for the door. The figure didn't follow, but stayed rooted in place, like some grotesque statue carved from shadow. As soon as I stepped outside, everything changed. The weight lifted from my chest, and the cold dissipated instantly. But when I looked back at the house through its darkened windows, he was still there, watching me. I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing at the end of that bar or heard those whispered voices warning me to stay away. I reported what happened to my supervisor but left out most of the details. Who would believe me? The Deane House manager called a week later to thank me for fixing their problem. The phone hadn't rung since, but her voice carried an edge of unease that told me she wasn't convinced it was over. Neither am I. Sometimes at night when everything is quiet and still, my own phone rings once before stopping completely, and every time it does, I wonder if he's found me again. The experience at the Deane House changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I used to see the world in terms of circuits and connections, problems that could be solved with the right tools and knowledge. Now, I'm acutely aware of the gaps in between, the spaces where logic fails and something else takes over. I've become more cautious in my work, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale static. My colleagues have noticed the change. They joke that I've become the ghost hunter of the telecom world, but they don't know how close to the truth they are. I've started researching the history of the Deane House, trying to piece together who that woman might have been or the man in the hat. There are so many stories, so many tragedies tied to that place. Which one reached out to me that night? And why? Part of me wants to go back to face whatever it was that I encountered. But a larger part, the part that still wakes up in a cold sweat at 2:17 a.m. every night, knows that some lines are better left disconnected. For now, I do my job and try to forget. But every time I pick up a phone, there's a moment, just a split second, where I brace myself for that voice to come through again. Because deep down, I know the truth. In a world of wireless communication and digital signals, there are still some calls that come from places no technology can reach. And sometimes, they're calling for you.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.